You're listening to the Intelligence Optimised podcast, the show where we cut through noise to what moves decisions. Follow now so you never miss an episode from Australia's critical industries. Sitting behind, performance, is a big support ecosystem, right? Maintenance, training, data integration. How does local industry plug into that in the regions we just discussed as well, and what does that look like?
I think just about everywhere is the same, right? So certainly all of those Quad nations would be looking to use their domestic capabilities to support. The platform's designed to be low footprint, heavy fuel logistics, so you can run it on diesel or JP5, JP8. Tool commonality, field repairability, training's under development. It'll be modular and progressive, and we'll have a good focus on simulation, both for learning to fly and fight the aircraft, but also for mission rehearsal. Looking at our region, perhaps like looking Oceania and maybe the nearby Pacific Islands. I anticipate, and one of my mandates is to drive a local manufacturing solution for the whole airframe, possibly in South East Queensland. And in fact, support agreements to achieve this are well underway. I think that manufacturing capability can extend beyond the airframe and into the various systems, electrical, fuel, avionics. The US, whilst in a protectionist phase, is absolutely still talking to distributed manufacturing. So having redundancy and geographical separation in production lines. So I could see, Australia becoming a production line for more than Oceania. I can see us building the whole aircraft here, sort of fleet size dependent. The opportunities in payloads are phenomenal. Like, we are one of the best payload designers in the world. So Melbourne's got two or three amazing payload design manufacturers in AVT, Arceus, what was Sentient. So our primary payload's likely to be the Arceus hyperspectral optical radar. And we do some great stuff here. So I've got to uncover all of those support options, and ideally what will happen is, we can make meaningful contributions to the platform and its capabilities, and then those things can get exported to the other countries. We'll be buying, hopefully, the platform at a lot more scale than we might see locally. Other opportunities locally, I'd say training, of a bit of a concept plan actually to bring training for all of Southeast Asia to Australia. So in limited discussions so far with several of those sort of APAC nations I mentioned, and they're all like, we love it, but we need to learn to fly and to fight, depending on who you are, the platform. And they just don't have anywhere to train with that size and capable drone. We got the perfect geography. We got great training areas, including right here in Queensland. So I think this is a great opportunity to be able to become a training hub for a bunch of nations, and not just for this platform, but for whatever sort of Group 3 platform exists. Our training requirement will be a little bit different because we'll want to drop precision guided munitions, drop sonar buoys, target for actual use of kinetic effectors, that kind of stuff. But I think there's a whole lot of opportunity here in training. One of my jobs is to select an Australian operational partner. It'll likely happen after we finish that testing in Q1 next year. But we got to find someone with a REOC, with a quality workforce, a quality training product, and they'll be able to sort of showcase the asset and conduct local training. Mate. So there's heaps of opportunities locally, and I'm all about getting after and seeing what they are and pitching them back to Mothership over in Texas.
Oh, lovely. If you need me to point you in the right direction of a good training and data organisation, let me know.
Yeah, well, data is so important, and again, that's another thing that we're brilliant at. Like, this thing can be controlled and can get its data feeds out via classified or unclassified low Earth orbit constellations. So Starlink, Starshield, Japan, I think it's in the middle of launching theirs. Maybe it's called Synspective. So we can control the bird and disseminate the feed from there. But, that whole concept of, putting stuff through a secure cloud, each country seems to be picking, a cloud partner. So, how we get this data, how we analyze it on board, how we get it to the right people, is really important. And absolutely, there's opportunity locally for that. You guys, Vax might be a natural partner there, given, the work I understand you're doing analytics, fusion, dashboards and whatnot, like every, that multi-federal agency kind of deal I was talking about before in Australia, like creating a user interface for that would be absolutely something that, is not in our lane, and we don't need it to be, but we could work with someone like you and Curtis to get that done.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of opportunities there, and to obviously to enhance the experience as well, not just for the users, but for those needing to understand what data's being collected and those actionable insights and what to do with it. Could you paint the Quad Coast Guard led data fusion initiative for us? How does Delta Black contribute?
Yeah. All right. So, we bring persistence in the air. We, we got a platform producing, somewhere between 12 to 16 kilowatts a power. So we'll bring an EOIR feed, a SAR feed with moving target indication, a ViDAR feed, a hyperspectral feed. Um, so we can be an amazing collector, and we can get that data off board. The concept was, that data flowing to a federated sovereign cloud, everybody keeping, their own ownership and keys. That shared layer would be track files, anomaly scores, behavior tags. You get to have a multi-nation picture without handing over raw sensitive content. Look, the tech, in terms of cloud tech, I am not a data expert here, but what I learned in the research phase for the Prezzo was that this stuff exists, right? So Accenture has a system, the Accenture Common Operating Picture, ACOP. They've been fusing data from airborne and surface platforms and whatnot for more than a decade. Azure has a system, Nutanix in the UK has a system, and no doubt we have domestic solutions. So, at a global level, I think there'll be multiple systems. The Quad, would be great if they could agree on one. And, in Australia, perhaps we focus on a domestic solution. And again, maybe that multi-federal agency concept I talked about could be a great place for a domestic solution.
Yeah, look, I tell you, from our angle, from a Vaxxer angle, these feeds that you're talking about, it's just pure gold, But what does Radar actually produce, and how do AI and ML convert that into decisions?
Yeah, I'm probably going to push this question right back at you, right? So what do? We provide an amazing collection capability. The new generation of sensors like Arcus's hyperspectral optical radar with sort of edge on board, they're taking literally terabytes of data on board, analyzing it, looking for whatever you're looking for, and then they put that out in kilobytes. So we'll provide, the bandwidth to get it off board and wherever it needs to go, and on board edge and what those chaps are able to do with those feeds to turn raw feed into fused data and into decisions is amazing. How do we further leverage that using AI and ML? That remains to be seen. But mate, you tell me, like, what can you do with that?
Well, I mean, it's probably easy enough to say it's endless, but it's about what's the art of the possible. But yeah, understanding, I guess, if especially with the intent of the platform, and the sorties will obviously produce, I guess, multiple parallel data streams. EO, IR videos, radar returns, metadata positions, perhaps, course, environmental context. We spoke about that a bit earlier.
Yeah,
So I'm sort of thinking
yeah,
maybe, the real value is not just the imagery, but it's the behavior pattern that's embedded within it.
100%, mate, 100%. I heard this great example actually at. I had a great example at Indo-Pac. You can program these systems to look for pretty much anything. So, I've had one speaker talking to an algorithm that detects, a vessel's track, its speed, direction, and whatnot, with both, active sensors or passive sensors that can see, but also the AS feed. Um, so then, an example one speaker gave was that they track all of the vessels kicking around the world and within their field of view, and they can look for a rapid deceleration of a vessel, which, they've got systems learning can reflect dropping the anchor and dragging it across data cables on the seabed. So now there's an algorithm sitting there within, edge sensors on board looking for that kind of thing and 1,000 other sort of scenarios where, hey, ding, 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 this thing was doing 10, 15 knots, then it was doing 2 knots and it's, 70 kilometres off Sydney Heads, right where, most of the connectivity for Australia comes in. That's not the kind of a thing a human operator can ever pick up on a raw feed, but a self-learning AI ML, it'll just get better and better at detecting that.
Yeah. And some of the things you can do, especially if you're thinking about maritime models, and what you've just described there is pattern of life. So, shipping routes, IUU activity, SAR signals, meteorological data, you know, and when you gather that, obviously, and you fuse those feeds and into that open source data but also your partner data, and that's, that's proprietary information as well, and what you can do is, fuse that into a single model and classify as normal versus, anomalous activity as well. So it won't just show what's out there, but it'll explain what's changing and why, and that's how I can see that, you can change, I guess, for want of a better term, your pixels into decisions. So it's not just pictures and you haven't just then got commanders going, "Well, shivers, what do I do with this?" Um, and that's the benefit, and that's the power of machine learning and where it's heading in Gen AI, and how it's just progressing daily as well. So, um, that's where there's definitely a lot of opportunity, I think, from, I guess, a data perspective.
Yeah, and I think, just looking domestically for a moment, we need, I think, expert companies like Vaxa to design this interface and to leverage that AI and ML to support efficient decision making. So, getting inside user organizations, understanding, what they need and yeah, like you say, being able to short circuit that and enable decisions instead of, hey, here's a feed for someone to look at for the next 10, 15 hours.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess you're touching on a really good point there. A couple of sovereign companies, you know, how do we, I guess, embrace that? And we've got zero trust clouds with, operator-owned keys that change sharing. Yeah, and maybe this is where, the likes of AXA and Delta Black, fuse into one trusted data fabric.
All those characteristics are, I think, so important. Zero trust, so you can authenticate every single call. So you're not putting poor data in. Maintaining control through those keys. I think at a domestic level, there's so much to do there. At like a quad level, I think still you'd ideally be looking for a single user interface, albeit maybe looking for different things for each nation. Globally, I think there's going to be a variety of solutions, but absolutely at a domestic and or international level, we're very keen to partner up and leverage each other's strengths and fill each other's gaps.
Yeah, and, like you said, how do you centralize that thinking? And, you sort of think about, well, you guys are essentially providing an airborne sensor network and, someone like us, provides the fusion brain, so to speak. And you think about this from, getting those in the quad to share information. They're very reticent to share information for a number of reasons, as we know. But, you could almost containerize each nation's node, zero trust, air gapped replication, operator owned keys. And that way intelligence can be shared selectively and revoked instantly. Um, and that could result in a distributed network of confidence, four nations seeing the same truth without giving up sovereignty.
Yeah, mate, could not agree more.
Gunny, let's move on to trust, tempo, and technology. You often say that persistence and presence win. How do autonomous systems and edge AI redefine tempo?
tempo is no longer about flying the fastest aircraft. It's about knowing first, acting first. And look at our platform. If you've got a 28-hour aircraft, Edge AI on board, we can turn a hundreds of nautical mile uncertainty box into a pin on a map at the moment behaviour changes. So, we can pivot from reactive search to proactive interdiction. That's the only way it's going to work, throughout an ocean mass the size of the Indo-Pacific. If you buy literally a couple of hundred Raider 330s or other Group 3 assets in lieu of a single addition to your MQ4, your MQ9 fleet, those two things are the same kind of price, a couple of hundred Group 3s versus one MQ4, MQ9. My feeling is you'll get presence over a much broader area simultaneously with the ability to respond to cues more quickly. Now, if something's happening in the Southern Ocean, we can launch from the Australian coast, or if you've got a node down in Antarctica or on Heard Island, we can launch from there. Got something going on out in the remote Indian Ocean territories, and we can launch a system from Christmas or Cocos Island. As I said earlier, we could even base, throughout the Pacific, Honiara, Rarotonga, Bonriki and the Kiribati, with next to no infrastructure costs to achieve that persistence and that presence. If I compare this to crewed aircraft, they can absolutely fly an exquisite twin turbo jet fleet, probably costing $50 million per US per platform, and get places quickly at 450 knots. In the Australian context, that might give us 3 or 4 nodes. If you had a blended fleet of those kind of jets and Group 3 platforms, we could have 20 nodes supporting multiple federal agencies, in the low tempo times, and the ability to have persistent presence. And made to be clear, the operator does not need to be at that node. You might have a few locally employed ground support people and an engineer or two, but that fleet could be centrally operated from Canberra inside the relevant headquarters, or at the node, or alongside our Pacific partners in their home locations, so we can build their knowledge, build the trust, and build capacity. You mentioned Edge AI. Well, that's what it's enabling, the data crunching and the analysis on board. It's what can get those multiple 20+ feeds fused and can get the data where it needs to go, even in a bandwidth constrained environment. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, traditional, ISR is episodic, right? You launch, collect, processed, and then act, and that's what you've just described, and that can take time, lots of resources, but, Edge AI just collapses that loop, really. And the next generation of platforms like yours, like the Raider 330, they carry onboard processors that can, run lightweight models, right at the edge there, I'm assuming. And, instead of streaming terabytes, they send back just a handful of classified insights in real time. And that's that actionable insights that people who need to make decisions need. They don't need a whole lot of information, that can take them time to process. They need, this can all be done now through Edge AI. And, that means you can detect an unregistered vessel or validate it against historical patterns, queue a patrol or satellite within seconds. And, it's that tempo without the footprint. You mentioned the footprint earlier as well, and that's really important. And it's probably the new currency of deterrence, really.
Yeah. And certainly we provide the volume and the power to get after that compute on board. My understanding at the moment is a lot of the compute we're talking of, it's actually living within the sensor. So it is the sensor manufacturer that is building that stuff inside that ball, or whatever format it's got. And we've got multiple spare kilowatts of power to be able to support that in that environment.
Wow. Things are progressing so quickly. It's fantastic. Gunny, you've lived, the RAF life, the Army aviation life, and in industry. Tell me, what translate to multi-agency missions now?
Oh, mate, there's the obvious, I guess, a couple of things: interoperability, standards, and trust. That the capability is pretty worthless if the agencies can't use it together. I think we need, common metadata, shared confidence scores, and governance, so we can, act upon insights without the bureaucratic drag. And that's, why the pitch was for federated data to keep trust intact. I would love to see our key federal agencies able to cooperate to utilise common assets, even just across defence and home affairs. That appears challenging sometimes. Like Op Sovereign Borders is a great example of how that can absolutely be achieved. We've also got our Air Force operating P8s in support of Border Force. But I think we could normalise this with a broader group of assets, and other key departments could benefit from the dual use methodologies these systems bring. When I last came on the VAXA podcast, we spoke about whole of government helicopters. That is a laid and misere of a plan. But, as was somewhat predictable, each agency is still running their own show, seeking their own dedicated assets, and those without budget are pretty much left with close to nothing, while a largely idle fleet sits by just in case. It's, in my humble opinion, bureaucracy and siloed pools of funding have got a whole lot to answer for.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? Especially when you've lived the life and you've seen it all from all angles as well. And it's all about really, the outcome you want is better outcomes for communities, but also for the warfighter, so to speak, or the operator. But it's also not good value for the taxpayer.
I was going to say there are several big things, that are I'd say somewhere in the phase of procurement right now. So I'll be very happy to be surprised should at the back end of a few of those procurements there be a little more collaboration.
These solutions, like, it can help the organisations. It can help the end user, the taxpayer, the people on the ground. At VAXA, like, our mantra is, decision superiority. And how do you think we move from more data to better decisions for commanders and policymakers? I mean, you've just touched on one big roadblock where, we're not even willing to share information internally, let alone, if we're gonna be doing this amongst Quad nations.
Look, I guess implicitly we've covered a little of this, but I think, by ruthlessly filtering for relevance, um, edge scoring will reduce the operator burden. Machine learning correlation, as you said before, would expose patterns that humans can't see. The design interface is so important, and the so what first. And then I think, we need to close the loop with after action learning, both by the system itself and the humans involved, so that our models and inputs can improve every time we use the system. I think you talk about decision superiority. I think that's a practice as opposed to a product. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, it can often be said that, more data can often cloud a picture. Decision superiority, though, it comes from there's context, clarity, and cadence. Making sure the right data hits the right decision window.
Yeah.
We've built analytics pipelines that compress signal chain from hours to minutes, and they integrate structured data, so sensor feeds, logs, with unstructured data, which is that social, human intelligence, and open source data. And then you can visualize confidence levels as well, not just dots on a map. And that's the shift from that the shift from situational awareness to situational understanding, which, as you just mentioned, there's a difference between um, you know, whether it's a product or whether it's an outcome. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, mate, I said before, I think what I pitched at Indo-Pac was a gateway project. And so while I talked about, starting with, group 3 feeds, you just mentioned a bunch of things just then. But, that's where we start. But I think, if that quad network got up, it's pretty simple to do it. Start with a Group 3 drone, but then surface and subsurface. We've got the Blue Bottle out there sailing around. There's just been a massive investment into sail drone. Thinking laterally, could we even have a white-hulled ghost shark capability? But adding those surface and subsurface feeds, adding in Jawn, long-range radar, the Coast Watch feeds, the fiber optic seabed monitoring. And also, and this is that maritime domain picture, like one domain enough is not enough. You need to get across all of them. But I think, we've got to eat this one bite at a time. And if there's an all singing, all dancing super spec to do everything at once, then it'll just never happen. And so the Indo-Pac pitch was, now let's get after this, but let's pick one domain, one asset, link that together, have the infrastructure there to then grow it into other domains.
Yeah, and speaking of other domains, I mean, yeah, there's and we sort of touched on this, with the white hole fleet, but there's obviously a commercial angle here. Do you think this architecture could become exportable to, commercial, organizations, for oil, shipping, fisheries, disaster response? I mean, you've sort of touched on the capability of the platform, but what about from commercially?
Right, absolutely. Swap a narcotics network for an illegal fishing ring, a contested strait for offshore energy field. Yeah, the math's the same. Big area, limited assets, high stakes. That same feeds to fuse stack um, can deliver risk scoring for shipping lanes, which impacts insurance and whatnot. Compliance dashboards for fisheries. Storm impact models for insurers. HADR tasking after cyclone. I think it's one architecture, many markets, and in each of those markets, we shouldn't be paying for it again and again and again, right? It's yeah, but absolutely, there's a commercial angle on all of this.
I can sort of see the way I've sort of been thinking about it the last few minutes is, you're replacing, a vessel of interest with a pipeline leak or, a reefer failure or cyclone impact and the logic probably still holds up. And, I guess that architecture's industry agnostic would be fair to say. Edge sensing and sovereign cloud and AI analytics, equals a live operational picture of any distributed network, be it ports, energy grids, humanitarian supply chains. So you're protecting, I guess you're swapping protecting sovereignty with protecting continuity of trade, which is so important to us as an island nation as well. Being able to link, some of the things we're doing at the moment with the portal that we've built is, linking, national security intelligence with, commercial resilience and, because, the sea lanes don't care who owns the ship, do they?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I'd link back to that earlier, the Delta Black design philosophy for the 330 and around that box. So what we see is individual users like having their box, doing with their box what they want. So, whatever systems you need on board to record, to be delivered, whatever, you've got your box, you control that. We can just pick it up, plug in the power, plug in the data connectivity, and off you go. So, I think we don't even know most of the roles that this kind of a system can and will be able to do.
Yeah. Gunny, we touched on it a bit earlier, the regional collaboration and capacity. Like you said, the Solis might not be able to afford and stand up a system like this, but how can the smaller Pacific islands and Indian Ocean island nations, how can they join without that big capital spend? And what would tiered access look like?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's pretty easy to join at whatever level of joining they would like. In that services model, we'd be focused on insights and, they'll get a lower tier of data that impacts them. So, if we have a look at fisheries enforcement or illegal deforestation in the Solomons, which in my time over there, I saw a whole lot of during the Ramsey mission. You figure out what data they want, and that can be classified and just sent in their direction. So not a whole lot of infrastructure at their end required to gather that. We gather the data, which effectively becomes the evidence, and then they can act upon it. So yeah, I think expenditure and infrastructure shouldn't be blocks to any of those nations. And if they want to take it a step further and actually have, bases where they are, then, group 3, group 2 is probably the right place to start where the larger nations will be happy for such systems to be operated from those locations. It's not going to be the end of the world should should a cyclone or a tsunami or whatever it might be kill that asset.
Yeah. And you mentioned, natural disasters there. I mean, natural disasters in our region alone are a $60 billion a year problem. Queensland's been warned to prepare this year for another busy cyclone season. and you flag that climate-driven, migration and disaster response. How would this network help? And I know one person who'd be very interested to hear of this is Minister Dan Purdy, the Queensland Police and Emergency Services Minister. Yeah, is there a practical pathway?
Absolutely, of course there is. No, I watch with fascination after each major disaster, and you see a couple of, I guess, what were authorised and some unauthorised feeds coming out. But with the sensors that exist these days, we can put a Group 3 drone where a helicopter can't go. The Arceus system, IMSAR's synthetic aperture radar, like they see through cloud, they see through smoke. So, one of these assets could sit above a major bushfire where all you see to the visible eye is smoke and see every vehicle and every person on the fireground and add some analysis, onboard analysis to that and kick that feed wherever you like. A cyclone response needs rapid damage mapping, temporary comms, missing person detection, logistics, blood products, radios, batteries to isolated communities. When you've got a system that can go up there for 28 hours and carry 50 kilograms of stuff, you can get urgent stores around a place in weather that would ground a helicopter and or weather that might in fact cause a vehicle loss, an air vehicle loss. But that's not the end of the world if it's an air vehicle worth a couple $100,000. So a single minister having police and emergency services, I think that simplifies governance for a dual use deployment. And it can be the same network that tracks illegal unauthorized fishing that pivots across to HADR or cyclone relief.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know that the Premier is also very interested in understanding how to do this better. And there's some great people in charge in Queensland, especially with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority with former General Jake Elwood. Was a great operator in defence and is doing a great job as the CEO at Queensland Reconstruction Authority. So there's people with lived experience as well in that space. General Elwood had a lot to do with the disaster space previously, and also now in this current role, and the people around him. And you and I have worked in those areas for a long time as well, fortunately or unfortunately. But and the government is,
Yeah,
the Queensland government especially is listening to how can we do things better? How do we engage industry? How do we engage products like Delta Blacks? And how do we
yeah.
use that and mesh that into a solution that that reduces the impact on communities with a faster response and recovery time?
Absolutely. And look, not just because I live in Brisbane in Queensland, but there are some amazing capabilities here. One of which is composite drone manufacture. So, I absolutely envisage Australian Raider 330s being built in South East Queensland. But one of the issues that came to mind then when you were speaking was, and this is I guess a lateral but a real blocking issue in Australia. I feel there is regulatory doubt as well as some capability doubt as to what the platforms can do. And where, someone that's seeking to spend money and be supported has both capability and regulatory doubt, both of which are just, shortfalls in education. There's an assumption that CASA and current systems can't operate with the right degrees of freedom, but they can. CASA are very forward-leaning, provide this good risk management, and there are a few companies getting amazing approvals, which could absolutely support timely disaster relief. Explorate out of WA have some amazingly broad approvals, including here in Queensland. Toll and Cruise Systems do pretty well as well. And look, there's a model which Delta Black will support globally, called COCO, or commercial owned, commercial operated. So you can literally pay per hour for surveillance performed. So if you've got doubt as to, can they get this thing airborne and will it give me the feed I need? There are commercial models kicking around where you're just paying per hour for delivered suitable feed. There isn't this there doesn't need to be this massive capital upfront cost and risk amongst the bureaucrats as to whether that will deliver or not. There are ways to get this in flying where you're only paying if you're getting what you're expected to get.
Yeah, I guess that's a really good example of how a public-private partnership could work, right? In this particular
Yeah.
instance, yeah, I know, especially in the disaster space, having worked with the state government on several solutions since the early 2000s is the initial thought of that capital outlay that they need to I guess provide. Well, that was the old model, but they don't need to own it. They don't need to maintain it. It can be, like you said, COCO.
Yeah, and 100%, and that can transition as well, right? So if standing up a capability, employing people, and keeping them current and online, and not losing them to other industry players was a block to border force, for example, then you could start the process, COCO, and agree up front and contract that within a period of years, months or years, that you'll transition that capability across to the uniformed sort of parapublic operator. So I think there's a whole lot of flexibility which is understood by various government agencies, and commercial entities. We would see Group 2 and Group 3 drones being used a lot more. You mentioned public-private partnerships. I think they're critical. Government needs to set the mission outcome. Industry delivers the tempo and the innovation. The contracting model should reward uptime, detection performance, response latency, not just the flight hours. But that'll keep the network sharp between the crises and make the costs reasonably predictable.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of bureaucrats want too, right? Is predictability on cost, especially with the way their KPIs are sort of measured and managed and set out.
And Todd, this is not a new model, right? So you look at a lot of the state-based aeromedical helicopter and fixed-wing contracts. They don't have uniformed people flying the helicopters. They don't own the helicopters unless they want to. They're just paying for a service. They're paying for hours flown with patient in back. So they're absolutely REOC or remote operating certificate holders with uncrewed systems in Australia who will take that risk on to deliver the service. And where you don't get the service, you don't pay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, keeps everyone on their toes, right? As well, because for years, people, it's been in disasters or defence, rightly or wrongly, operators have seen that as the put the snout in the trough, and government will just pay anyway. But if you get a bit more commercial about it, you're going to get better outcomes.
Yeah, agreed.
Gunny, I just want to move on to the future a little bit here, because it's very exciting, what you've created and where you're heading with Delta Black. But you frame the quad group UAS proposal as feeds to fused to future. What does the future look like if we get it right?
Look, I guess at that proposal specifically, and then more broadly in Oceania or ANZ, it looks like we get a Coast Guard-led region-wide fabric of persistent sensing governed by federated zero-trust clouds. Everyday security improves. Grey zone ambiguity shrinks. Search and rescue and disaster recovery get faster and more precise. Protected logistics becomes an operational habit, not a PowerPoint concept, which it's been for a few years. And regionally, we get a quieter form of deterrence based on clarity of what's going on.
Wow, it's a win-win for everyone. I love that. You've provided us with a lot of detailed information here, which is extremely astonishing. If you could leave not just quad leaders, but our local government and our federal government leaders with one line, before the Indian Quad dialogue coming up in 2026, what would it be?
Matt, I'd say that long endurance drones and sovereign cloud could do for Indo-Pacific security or national security and maritime domain awareness what GPS did for navigation. They can quietly transform everything. And this is about leveraging assets and technology we already have, cooperation we already believe in, to build that white-hulled network and start sharing insights right now. And whether you're talking about the Indo-Pacific or a cyclone in North Queensland, it's the same thing. And it can be the same assets, the very same assets, and the very same sunk costs, but with increased capability.
That makes sense. And that makes sense. They've just all got to collaborate and get together. Colin, thanks for the signal and not just the noise. For agencies exploring Group 3 persistence, check out Delta Black's Radar 330 and talk to Colin's team about trials and local support across Australia, New Zealand, India, and the Pacific. And if you want the operational context around those feeds, subscribe to the VAXA Bureau portal, where open source and human intelligence are aligned to your objectives with secure workflows your teams can use tomorrow. Our vision is a legacy advancing individuals, organisations and the Indo-Pacific to be ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. See the links in the show notes, and we'll see you next episode.